Welcome to the deep dive. We've gone through stacks of sources, biographies, financial reports, you name it, covering some of the world's most powerful empires and the tycoons behind them.
Yeah, and what we're trying to do today is really get under the hood, distill the core mechanics of how extreme power actually works.
Exactly. We're looking at the culture you need to build it, the kind of political muscle required to protect it, and then, well, the often messy and brutal business of passing it on. Succession.
And it's fascinating, the patterns you see. We're talking high-stakes stuff. Think
Really?
Elon Musk deciding to literally cut a piece off a rocket skirt an hour before launch because, well, he thought it would still work, amplifying risk.
Or, jumping decades later, the almost surreal scene with the Gucci family after a death, the house being sealed off immediately based on a court order from the heirs.
Right. These aren't just business stories. They're dramas about ego, about corruption, unchecked control, and this intense fight for legacy.
So let's start there with the culture. Section 1, the founder's shadow. It seems like building these things requires this almost hardcore, high-risk approach from day one.
Oh, absolutely. It's fundamental.
Yeah.
And it's not just about having a vision. These founders often seem to operate differently, psychologically maybe, than your average CEO. They don't just manage risk. Sometimes they seem to thrive on it.
Musk is maybe the prime example today, isn't he? His old PayPal colleagues apparently said he wasn't about risk mitigation like everyone else. He was about amplifying risk and burning the boats. No retreat.
That's the perfect phrase for it. And it plays out in engineering decisions that would make traditional players just blanch, like that rocket skirt incident.
Wait, walk us through that again. Engineers find cracks.
Yeah, two small cracks in the engine skirt of the second stage.
Yeah.
A critical part. Normally, that's a definite no-go for launch. You stop everything.
You replace it, you figure out why it cracked, you delay.
Safety protocols, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
Weeks, maybe months of delay. But Musk, his immediate reaction wasn't, oh no, failure. It was, okay, what if we just cut the skirt, like physically remove the cracked part?
Cut it off, knowing it would make the engine shorter, less powerful, potentially unstable.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the calculation, done incredibly quickly, like less than an hour, was that they could still make the mission work even with that reduced thrust.
And they actually did it. With shears.
Apparently so. A team performed what you could call emergency surgery on the rocket, right there on the pad. It launched the next day. The NASA people watching were reportedly just stunned in disbelief.
That sheer willingness to just break the rules, push the limits for speed, that defines the culture, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Now, compare that sort of explosive risk-taking with someone like Jeff Bezos. The intensity is there, absolutely, but it's directed differently. It's more internal, focused on perfecting the system.
And that could be pretty brutal for the people working there, from what the sources say. Extremely difficult to work for.
That's the common description. Capable of acerbic outbursts, maybe like Steve Jobs in that way. But his genius, if you want to call it that, was in seeing the business itself as a machine that had to be frictionless.
So things we might see as normal business functions, he saw as problems.
Exactly. Take customer service calls. Most companies see that as, helping the customer. Bezos reportedly viewed a customer having to call as a defect in the system.
Wow. So the goal wasn't necessarily empathy. It was to build self-help tools or systems so good that human interaction just wasn't needed.
Precisely. Eliminate the defect.
Yeah.
That drive for flawless, self-correcting systems creates immense pressure. Unforgiving standards, tight resources, constant drive for efficiency. It can lead to burnout, sure, but it also built Amazon. It's about optimizing the system, maybe over-optimizing the human element.
And you see echoes of that same need for control, maybe born from a different place, way back with Ray Kroc at McDonald's. His early drive wasn't about system perfection initially, was it? It was more about feeling cheated.
Yeah, his initial experience was steeped in frustration and financial paranoia almost. He felt the McDonald brothers were stringing him along, holding him back. He talked about feeling blindfolded by their assurances.
And there was that specific incident with the land deal.
Right. He ended up having to pay $25,000, a lot of money then, for land from the Fraislocks, people connected to the brothers. He called it blood money. He felt completely taken advantage of.
He's out there working like crazy, 52 years old, literally mopping floors in his suit to show commitment.
While feeling like the guys whose name he was building into an empire were just milking him. That sense of being wronged, of being financially vulnerable, it seems to have fueled his absolute determination to take total control. Buy them out, control the real estate, control everything.
So whether it's defying norms like Musk's, systemizing everything like Bezos, or overcoming that feeling of being cheated like Croc. There's this intense, almost obsessive drive for control at the heart of it.
That seems to be the common thread. And once you have that kind of hardcore culture and centralized control, well, the ethical lines can get very blurry very fast.
Which brings us nicely to the next point. Centralized power, often leading to, let's say, corporate toxicity or ethical ambiguity. Theranos is the poster child here, right? The sources lay out the deception pretty clearly.
Oh, it's technically quite specific. The core problem was their famous Edison machines, the ones supposed to do all the tests on a drop of blood. They largely didn't work. So to produce results, they had to secretly use standard off-the-shelf lab machines.
But those machines need way more blood than the tiny finger prick samples Theranos was getting. That was their whole unique selling proposition.
Uh,
So how did they square that circle?
they diluted the samples,
Hmm.
added saline solution to make the tiny blood volume large enough for the conventional machines to even register it.
Okay, but diluting blood surely messes up the results. You're trying to measure the concentration of things, right?
Exactly. Massively diluting the sample means the concentration of the analytes, the very things they claim to be measuring, drops way down, often below reliably detectable levels. So the results weren't just inaccurate, they were fundamentally compromised. They knew it.
And when the wheels started coming off, when the Newark lab issues surfaced, how did Elizabeth Holmes handle it internally?
Pure self-preservation. The ethical move would have been transparency, shared responsibility. Instead, the sources say she sacrificed her boyfriend, Sonny Balwani. He was the COO, her number two, and also, her partner.
She fired him and framed it as a voluntary retirement.
Correct. Pinned the blame, protected herself and the narrative.
Yeah.
It's a stark example of how, when the core operation is based on a lie, the absolute power of the founder gets used to protect that lie, above all else, even personal relationships.
Now let's contrast that very modern, almost brazen Silicon Valley deception with, say, John D. Rockefeller Sr. a century earlier. His style was completely different, wasn't it? All discretion.
Totally different style. Same underlying ruthlessness. Rockefeller cultivated this incredibly unassuming public image. He lived in a relatively modest house for his wealth, $40,000, on Cleveland's Euclid Avenue, which was already known as Millionaire's Row. He wanted to blend into the scenery.
And this wasn't just about taste, was it? There was a strategic element.
Absolutely. Partly it might have been genuine, a sort of Puritan's discomfort with possessions, as one source puts it. He was quiet, used "we" constantly when talking about Standard Oil. But this modesty was also a shield. It masked the sheer industrial power he was wielding.
Because behind that quiet facade, he was absolutely brutal with competitors. How did he handle people trying to essentially leverage his dominance?
He had zero tolerance for what he called blackmailers. These were people who'd start a small refinery basically just to force Standard Oil to buy them out at an inflated price. Rockefeller refused. He let them struggle.
And when they inevitably failed and had to sell cheap.
He showed no pity. His comment was chillingly direct. A good sweating will be healthy for them. That's the quiet, systematic elimination of competition. The modesty makes a predator harder to see.
Okay, so fast forward again. If Rockefeller used quiet control and Holmes used outright deception, how did Jack Welch at GE represent a sort of modern evolution of this? The sources talk about financialization.
And Welch perfected it. He took General Electric light bulbs, turbines, a classic industrial giant, and essentially turned it into a massive, unregulated bank through GE Capital.
And GE Capital became huge, right? Like the majority of the company's profits eventually.
Astonishingly so. At its peak, it accounted for something like 60% of GE's profits. The tail was absolutely wagging the dog, making actual things became secondary to moving money around.
Why? Was it just easier,
Yep.
more profitable?
Both. The sources suggest the industrial side was facing tough global competition, especially from Japan in the 80s. Finance offered smoother, more predictable earnings growth, which is what Wall Street craved.
And Welch used GE Capital to deliver that predictability.
Consistently, he managed to meet or beat analysts' estimates for nearly 80 quarters in a row. An unbelievable run. But how? By using GE Capital as this opaque slush fund, basically. Shifting numbers around through a complex global web of subsidiaries, using accounting methods that were, well, aggressive, let's say. Some called it dubious.
So the pattern seems to be establish aggressive culture, centralize power, and then use that power, whether through technical lies, quiet predation, or financial engineering, to maintain the appearance of unstoppable success, sometimes regardless of the reality underneath.
That nails it. Welch's famous response when asked how GE would compete with the Japanese was blunt. be more brutal. That brutality, often masked, becomes the operational imperative.
Okay, so once that internal engine of control is built, the focus shifts outward, right? Wielding influence over the state, the market, public opinion, Section 2.
Exactly. This is where the tycoon becomes more than just a business leader. They become a political force, sometimes without even holding office. Their control over essential parts of the economy or media becomes leverage.
And William Randolph Hearst is maybe the ultimate example of weaponizing media, isn't he? He seemed to actually enjoy being controversial.
He absolutely did. He understood publicity instinctively. There's a great story where one of his editors was worried about being investigated by some patriotic league. Hearst just laughed and asked, "What is the matter?
Yeah.
Can't you stand an investigation?"
No fear of bad press at all.
Quite the opposite. He apparently boasted, "I just love to be investigated," because he knew how to turn adverse mention to immediate account. Any attention, good or bad, just made him bigger, more powerful. He needed to dominate the conversation.
And this wasn't just about selling papers. It had real political weight. Even President Roosevelt felt it.
Yeah, Teddy Roosevelt, despite apparently liking Hearst personally, privately complained the publisher was doing a disservice to the nation. He said Hearst used his papers like a club over the members of Congress.
A club. That says it all, doesn't it? The media power was so immense that politicians' careers could depend on how Hearst's papers treated them. Even the president had to handle him carefully.
And that dynamic hasn't really changed, has it? Look at Robert Maxwell, decades later. His motivations were maybe more desperate, purely financial, but the goal was still political influence.
Right. His company, MCC, its share price was everything. His whole empire was balanced on it.
It became inextricably tied to the share price. So he was constantly engaging in a succession of stratagems, essentially maneuvers, to prop it up. Political connections were part of that game.
But he wasn't exactly subtle about it, was he? That incident when he was bidding for the news of the world?
Oh, that was incredibly clumsy.
Mm-hmm.
He publicly announced he'd resign his seat as a member of parliament if his bid succeeded, trying to look committed, I guess. But he hadn't even told his own agent in his constituency.
So the agent, Jim Lyons, finds out from the news. How embarrassing.
Hugely embarrassing. It just showed he saw politics purely as a tool for his business deals, with little regard for the actual political process or the people involved. Very transactional, very transparently self-serving.
Now contrast that with Andrew Carnegie. He had a different kind of influence, almost an immunity born from sheer stature.
Carnegie was almost like industrial royalty by the late 19th century. His relationship with the government, like with President McKinley's administration, was one of immense respect, even when he disagreed with them vehemently.
Like during the Philippine-American War, he was fiercely anti-imperialist.
Extremely. He got deeply involved in the anti-annexation movement. And he went remarkably far in his public statements.
How far? What did he actually say?
He publicly suggested that American soldiers should effectively mutiny, that they should refuse to fight in the Philippines.
Wow. In wartime, suggesting soldiers refuse orders. That sounds like sedition.
Under normal circumstances from almost anyone else, yes, it probably would have led to legal trouble. But Carnegie, because of his immense wealth, his philanthropic reputation, and maybe the administration's own professed commitment to free speech, no legal action was taken. That's profound power, the power to openly challenge government policy during a war and face no consequences.
So influencing the state can take many forms, from wielding media like a club to clumsy political maneuvering to simply being too big or respected to challenge.
Precisely. And that power naturally extends into manipulating the markets themselves, often by evading or bending regulations.
The LIBOR scandal is a chillingly clear example of this on a global scale. Tom Hayes, the trader at the center, he knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he?
Oh, completely. He was aggressively trying to get banks, including his own employer Citigroup, to lower their LIBOR submissions, this key global interest rate, purely to benefit his own trading positions, which were massive.
And he knew it was wrong, knew it was illegal. The evidence is right there in his messages.
Yeah, he literally instructed a colleague involved in the manipulation to make sure not to put it in writing. He understood the legal risk, the need to hide the trail, even while actively committing the fraud. It's that combination of sophisticated awareness and, frankly, a total lack of ethical boundaries.
And the sources also paint this weirdly mundane picture of his personal life alongside this massive global fraud.
It's almost comical if it weren't so serious. Trying to reschedule a meeting, he apparently explained he couldn't do Sunday night because, and I quote, "Sunday night I get sex." And since it was only once a week, he was reluctant to go out that night.
A guy manipulating global interest rates, potentially affecting trillions of dollars in financial contracts, worried about missing his weekly sex appointment. The banality is jarring.
It really is. It highlights the disconnect between the immense power these individuals can wield in the system and their sometimes quite ordinary or even petty personal lives.
Okay, shifting from financial manipulation back to physical infrastructure. Cornelius Vanderbilt in the 19th century. He showed how one person could hold an entire city hostage, right?
A truly shocking example, as one source calls it. Vanderbilt had already made a fortune using ruthless tactics in shipping, basically forcing competitors to pay him not to compete. He applied that same logic to railroads.
And the big move was cutting off New York City.
During a particularly harsh winter, he just stopped his New York Central railroads from connecting with other lines into Manhattan. Because most lines terminated in New Jersey and needed ferries, controlled indirectly by Vanderbilt to reach the city, this effectively cut off supplies.
So coal, food, passengers, everything vital gets choked off because one man decides to flex his muscles.
Pretty much. He put the city under a private blockade. The reaction was furious. The Brooklyn Eagle newspaper called it no act more criminal, saying he put the metropolis in a state of strict blockade. It was a raw demonstration of how private control over essential infrastructure could override public need.
And then, for a modern example of someone operating almost entirely outside or around state control, we have the arms dealer Victor Bout, a freebooting plutocrat.
Bout was the epitome of the post-Soviet entrepreneur who used connections and chaos to build a global network. His entire business model involved dodging sanctions aimed at stopping his arms trafficking.
How did he manage that so effectively?
Constant shapeshifting. He would just keep reorganizing, changing the names of companies, creating new firms, or reviving old ones. Sanctions would target one entity, he'd just pop up with another. He operated through a complex web that was incredibly hard for authorities to pin down.
And the ultimate irony is that despite being notorious, despite documented links to groups like the Taliban, his services became useful, even to the U.S.
That's the incredible part. His fleet of old, rugged Soviet-era cargo planes could fly anywhere, under almost any conditions. When the U.S. military needed to get supplies into incredibly difficult places like post-invasion Iraq, places where regular contractors wouldn't or couldn't go.
They hired Bout, the sanctioned arms dealer.
They did. Briefly, quietly.
Yeah.
He became a sort of secret delivery man because he got things done, no questions asked. It was deeply embarrassing for the Bush administration when it came out, but it showed that sometimes logistical necessity and chaotic environments can override even major geopolitical sanctions. Utility trumps policy.
So the toolkit for wielding influence is broad.
Yeah.
Intimidate through media, manipulate financial systems, control physical infrastructure, or just be so useful in the gray areas that even governments have to look the other way sometimes.
That covers the range pretty well. Build the internal machine, then use its power to shape the external environment to your advantage. But then comes the final act, passing it all on.
Right. Section 3, the succession crisis, the fight for the crown. This seems almost inevitable, doesn't it? The very things that made the founder successful, that intense ego, that absolute control, make letting go incredibly difficult.
It's structurally baked in. How do you hand over something you've built through sheer force of will, often seeing it as an expansion of yourself? Delegation feels like dilution. Succession feels like replacement.
Stephen Schwartzman at Blackstone is a good example here. The sources mention his designated successor, James, being very aware of the risks.
James knew the history. He apparently commented that heirs apparent in these situations often end up bloodied, dumped in the ditch. Blackstone was known as a, quote, very intense firm with a very intense leader. Challenging or even just preparing to succeed, that leader is inherently dangerous territory.
So the founder might even subconsciously sabotage the process because the successor represents a threat to their own identity and ongoing power.
It's a classic paradox.
Yeah.
You want the empire to outlive you, but you struggle to empower the person who will make that happen because it means acknowledging your own diminishing role or even mortality. Schwartzman eventually navigated it, but it's rarely smooth.
But sometimes succession is handled strategically. Robert Iger at Disney seems like a counterexample. He actively maneuvered for the top spot.
Iger was incredibly strategic. After CEO Frank Wells died unexpectedly, Iger saw the vacant COO role as his clear path to eventually succeed Michael Eisner. But his masterstroke was arguably the Pixar acquisition.
Because he had to manage Steve Jobs, who was notoriously difficult.
Exactly. Iger understood Jobs' personality perfectly. He knew Jobs was constitutionally incapable of a long, complicated back-and-forth negotiation. Jobs hated the bureaucracy, the endless haggling typical of big corporate deals.
So if the Pixar deal got bogged down in Disney's usual process.
Jobs would likely just walk away in frustration, which would have killed the deal and probably damaged Iger's standing. So Iger made sure the negotiation was relatively quick, clean, and tailored to keep Jobs engaged.
He played to Jobs' impatience, essentially.
You could say that. It was smart maneuvering. Securing Pixar was huge for Disney, and it cemented Iger's reputation as the indispensable successor, paving his way to the CEO job. He was succession achieved through strategic competence and psychological insight.
And then you have the opposite, the founder whose refusal to let go leads to disaster. Henry Ford and the Model T.
The classic cautionary tale. Ford became utterly fixated on the Model T. He saw it as perfection, the final word in automobiles, and stubbornly refused to update it or introduce new models, even as the market changed and competitors innovated.
And this caused a huge fight with his son Edsel, who wanted to modernize.
A major rift. Edsel saw the writing on the wall, saw General Motors catching up and surpassing them with more varied, stylish offerings. But Henry wouldn't budge. His ego was tied completely to the Model T.
And the business consequences were severe.
Immediate and dramatic. General Motors overtook Ford in estimated earnings for the first time in, 15 years? All because the founder couldn't adapt, couldn't let his creation evolve beyond his initial vision. The creator became the company's biggest liability.
Which leads us to what happens when the founder is gone or forced out and the family is left to fight over the spoils. This often gets really personal, really messy. The Gucci family saga is just intense.
Oh, it's pure dynasty drama. Years of simmering resentment and dysfunction boiling over. You had figures like Paolo Gucci constantly poking at the finances, asking awkward questions like how the U.S. shops could have huge turnover but almost no declared profit.
And the patriarchs, like Aldo Gucci, seem to use money explicitly to control their sons.
Yeah, the sources say Aldo kept his sons on tight salaries, supposedly to keep them humble and in line. Then he'd give them big bonuses sporadically just to make them smile, essentially keeping them dependent and emotionally manipulated. Wealth as a leash.
That breeds resentment, obviously. There's that powerful scene described between Maurizio Gucci and his father, Rodolfo.
Maurizio apparently fought back tears of rage, rejecting his father's demand for total submission, saying he wouldn't be a robot who obeyed your orders.
Right.
It's that crushing pressure where family dynamics are completely warped by the demands of the business empire.
And then after Maurizio's murder, the legal realities snap into place instantly.
Instantly. His partner at the time, Paola, finds herself shut out. A court official shows up to seal the house based on a sequester filed by the heirs of Maurizio Gucci, his daughters. The personal relationship meant nothing legally in that moment. It became purely about securing the assets for the bloodline.
That idea of inherited trauma, of wrestling with the legacy, you see it clearly with the Rockefellers, too, especially John D. Rockefeller Jr.
Jr.'s upbringing was incredibly intense, almost suffocatingly moralistic. His mother, Seti, and grandmother, Grandma Spellman, were deeply, deeply pious. Seti famously said she was glad her son told her what he wanted for Christmas, so now it could be denied him.
Wow. Denial as a virtue. And he took oaths against vice very young.
By age 10, he'd sworn off tobacco, alcohol, and profanity. He was molded into this figure of extreme rectitude and self-control.
And this intensely moral man inherits the empire built by his father, who many saw as a ruthless corporate criminal. That's a huge internal conflict.
It's the core paradox. How do you reconcile this inherited fortune, built through methods you've been raised to abhor, with the intense piety drilled into you? Junior spent his life trying to navigate that, largely through philanthropy, trying to legitimize the money, perhaps. The subsequent generations continue that struggle.
And George Soros offers another angle on this wrestling, not just with the morality of the fortune, but with the very nature of the father figure who came before.
Soros spent much of his life reflecting on his father, Tivadar, whom he called a Lebenskünstler, an artist of life. But Soros seemed perpetually unsure of his father, who survived incredible hardship in WWI Siberia, was ultimately strong or had somehow withdrawn, lost ambition due to the trauma.
This uncertainty about his father's strength influenced his own path.
Deeply, it seems. His later massive philanthropic and policy work, his attempts to shape societies, he described it partly as exploring ways to use my money. It was almost like he was trying to prove something, perhaps grapple with that legacy of perceived strength or weakness through his own global interventions. It gave his work a deeply personal, introspective layer. Even if professional policy people sometimes saw him as just a wealthy outsider.
Okay, so pulling it all together as we wrap up, what are the main takeaways from digging through all these stories of empire?
Well, a few patterns really stand out. First, you almost always see this need for absolute, centralized control to even build these things in the first place.
Mm.
It often requires a leader willing to be ruthless, whether it's Musk cutting rocket parts or Rockefeller sweating competitors.
Second, there's this constant dance between private power and the state. Sometimes it's direct influence, like Hearst wielding his papers like a club. Sometimes it's manipulating the system, like the LIBOR traders. And sometimes, like Bout, it's about operating in the cracks, becoming almost too useful or too slippery to be stopped.
And third, succession is almost always fraught. The transition of power carries this huge cost, both financially and emotionally. The family drama, the trauma, the backstabbing, it seems less like an aberration and more like a feature of transferring such immense concentrated power and wealth. The fight for the crown is brutal.
And there's maybe a deeper structural point here, tying into the work of economists like Thomas Piketty.
Right. Piketty's analysis of wealth inequality hinges on a simple but powerful idea. If the rate of return on capital, what he calls R, is consistently greater than the rate of economic growth, G, then wealth inequality tends to increase automatically over time. Kuti Joel.
So basically, if you already have a lot of money, your money makes money faster than the economy grows overall for everyone else. The rich get richer faster just because they're rich.
And Piketty argues this isn't just a small effect. It can significantly amplify the divergence. Huge fortunes can build up extremely quickly, within decades, purely through this mechanism of unequal returns, reinforcing existing advantages.
So the final thought we want to leave you with is this. Considering Piketty's framework, are the intense power struggles, the ethical compromises, the messy successions we've been talking about, are they just the human drama that plays out on top of this underlying economic engine?
Could it be that all the ruthlessness, the control, the family conflict is simply the necessary, maybe unavoidable mechanism through which these extreme concentrations of capital are defended, maintained, and passed down through generations, in a system where true dollars tends to outpace star dollars? Is the fight for the crown just the face of capital perpetuating itself?